Good morning. I just want to check that. So, do you largely understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So, at least, so I every now and then try to say something which is outrageous just to make sure that you're listening, or telling a joke. That's also is another way of trying to find out. I've changed my mind again about what to do. I will do one thing here that before we move on the detailed level, I would like to show to you how I, when I give a talk, try to explain what are the essential concepts in the Earth for All model. And it's, again, really sad that you can't read. There is no way, Ulrik, that one can expand this thing. Does it help on the view? I don't think so. Do any of you know how you would expand the size of a PowerPoint presentation?
You can expand the view, but then you see only a portion of it.
Yeah, because, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so then I need to, yeah. Okay, I'll have to. So the point is that this is a spaghetti diagram, a cause and effect diagram, which captures the most important things. And I'll try to go through, because this is another way of trying to understand what is inside, this very complicated box. So in reality, one of the two central things, if you want to describe this at a high level, and notice here I am disregarding the population issue in order to make things a little simpler. So you should think about the fact that yes, there is a population outside and it is being, so there is the GDP as a central concept, and there is the accumulated environmental damage. So these are in many ways the two main determinants of the system. It's the population, which is not any graph. It's the GDP, which is the value of the annual production of goods and services. And it is the accumulated environmental damage. So this is the biodiversity loss. This is the climate. It is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the reduction in fertility in agricultural land, etc. And then out here, you have the fourth important element, average well-being. And it is important, I forgot to say that before, well-being in the model system is the well-being of the global majority. So it is the well-being of the 90%. It is not the well-being of the owners. So it's the well-being of the workers. Luckily, owners are such a small minority that in democratic society, in a rational, democratic society where workers understand that they are being exploited by the rest of the tiny minority, they would put in place a lot of policy which would increase their well-being and reduce the well-being of the rich. That's the distributional issue. So that's average well-being, GDP, accumulated environmental damage. How does it work? In order to calculate the GDP, you need to know the physical output of the system. You know how many goods and services are actually being produced, and you multiply by the price and you get the GDP. The output of the system, the physical annual output of goods and services, is determined by the capacity of the system. What is the capacity of the system? The economists call it the potential GDP. This is the ability of the existing capital stock and the labor and their training and the technology to produce output. So this is determined by capacity, which in turn is determined by capacity addition and the discard of capacity, which is not drawn here for simplicity. And now comes the important thing. The capacity in reality in global society, in our view, consists of two things. It's the private sector capacity and it is the public sector capacity. We don't only look at one aggregate capacity, we have the two, which is important because we want to explain well-being, and well-being depends on the split between the two capacities. And so in order to stress this point, we say that private capacity is determined by, and we write the long word here, profit-driven investment in productive capacity. So this is not when super rich people put money into shares or into real estate or into gold. Most of the investment flows, the saving flows in the rich world, like particularly in the United States, goes into totally non-productive capacity, which has no effect on capacity and output, but simply shifts wealth around, you know. And then the other thing that increases capacity is tax-financed government spending on public well-being, or well-being for the majority. So the investment part of the public spending leads to increased capacity. For instance, the spending on money on education increases the capacity. The spending on public money on infrastructure leads to increased capacity, increased output, etc. Then you ask the question, what determines the savings? What determines the profit-driven investment in productive capacity? Well, here, for once, neoclassical theory has a point. You know, it is actually the savings. It's the surplus. It is actually what the workers don't get, you know, which is the potential, which is the savings, and the savings is the potential investment. I've already made one important point, which is normally disregarded by neoclassicists, namely that most of the savings are not used for productive investment. They're used for buying shares, as I say. And then the right side is trying to convince us that buying shares, you know, supporting the stock market, actually leads to more money into the productive capacity. I doubt that. You know, that is not how it works. It shifts monetary fortune. The current situation in the property market of Germany is a wonderful example of where, you know, the value of property has gone sky high, you know, because of the interest developments and because of the fact that many people put their savings into real estate, you know, instead of putting into productive capacity. Then you ask the question, where does the savings come from? And they come, of course, it's a certain fraction of the national income. What determines the national income is, of course, the GDP, which is determined by output, which is determined by capacity, which is determined by capacity addition, which is determined by profit. So here you have the central growth loop in the model system. The growth of the private sector, you know, taking place in a capitalist society in a certain way, which leads to a certain high level of savings. Other ways of organizing society takes a lot of the income into taxes, which are then used to finance the building of the public sector, which then also leads to capacity and GDP. Because, of course, when you then build a school, you know, the construction work is included in the GDP at the value of the thing that is being built. And if you use public money to pay for nurses, you know, yes, that increases the GDP. They even pay professors every now and then, and this also leads, you know, to an increased GDP. It's interesting, and this was my illusion in sentence number 3 in yesterday's talk. For those of you who know national accounting, you know when you try to calculate the GDP, it's easy to calculate the GDP in the private sector because you just take the volume of locomotives or cars and you multiply with the market price of these things, and that's the GDP. So what about my lecture now? This is really productive work of services. This is entered into the national accounts. Yes, it is. How? They typically they enter it at cost. So the whole health sector, the public health sector, is booked not at the market value of those fantastic health services that we provide in our public health system. It's entered at the idiotically low salary that we're willing to pay for the nurses. And these type of built-in biases in favor of viewing the world as a place where the private sector should be big and the public sector should be small. These are the types of things that the reformed GDP movement ought to be working on. Instead, they're working on things that we can spend another 2 hours on, which are totally misleading in my mind and just not hitting the goal. But shouldn't talk about it. So this is the central growth curve. Then you start asking the question, so what determines then taxes in society, the tax level? The split between the two types of things. I forgot to say one more thing before I take it. We are, of course, in the end, interested in the effect of all of this, not on GDP, but on the well-being. And so you see how, where is the disposable income? Here. So, of course, part of this thing, the consumption fraction, typically, is disposable income, goes here. And then the tax finance government spending, public services per person, also goes in here, to form two of the components of the well-being. So the more you do public spending, the higher the well-being. The more you do the GDP and national income, the higher the well-being. But let me take the outer loop first. So when you produce output, there is a footprint. You use, so physical output requires energy, crops, and materials. These are the three main components of the physical footprint. In order to get crop, you need to cut down the rainforest. In order to get more resources, you have to dig further down in the Atlantic to get the materials. In order to get more energy, you have to either burn more coal or build renewables. And so more output leads to more use of energy, food, crops. It should have said crops and materials, because it is not only food, it is the food and feed, which is important. And of course, the feed production is very big compared to the food production in rich countries. The use of energy, crops, and materials leads to emissions and biodiversity loss, which over time, you see those crosses simply means that things take time, leads to accumulated environmental damage, which in the very, very long term, and here is missing one of those delay marks, leads to the fraction of capacity in green solutions. Finally, after the world has watched, what is this I call the, extreme weather for a long enough time, or seeing the removal of the rainforest long enough time, finally they start supporting, us greenies, that something needs to be done. And it turns out that the easiest way to represent this at a very high level is to try to look at the economy as one entity, and then asking the question, what share of this total economy is actually involved in green solutions? So how many produce windmills and solar panels as opposed to those that produce fossil fuels? How many produce electric cars compared to those that produce fossil cars? How many do regenerative agriculture compared to those that do, etc.? So this is a concept which is, it doesn't have a good name, so I call it fractional capacity in green solutions or with green solutions. Damage reduction, repair, whatever, but it is the fraction which is green. And the fraction which is green is bigger if there is support for public action. I'll come back to this. So it is easier if there is a society that is willing to support public activity to increase the fraction than it is for a society where there is social tension and not easy to do so in the model system. The other important effect of the green solutions is that they are more expensive. You know, that's the reason why things does not happen by themselves very quickly. You know, had the windmills and the solar panels and the electric cars and the regenerative agriculture and more education for women and higher taxes on the rich, if those things had been profitable from an investor point of view, you know, a man who tries to maximize his return, if those things had been profitable in the current world, which is totally full of capital, you know, there would be a Niagara Falls of money into those things. There is a trickle. And the reason is this thing does not want to cook. Huh? Yeah. Because I'm worried it will be black. What? Oh, no, here. Okay. So that derailed me completely. Where was I? I tried.
I wanted to come to the regulation and bans and subsidies.
No, I wanted to come to the increase in resource cost. So one of the good things of moving societal capacity into green solutions is that it leads to reduction in emissions and biodiversity loss, so that it reduces the accumulated damage. And so here is a good circle, you know, that you are actually, if there is lots of green activity, it actually reduces the emissions per unit of output. But it costs. So it leads to higher costs. So the electric car is more expensive than the fossil car. In most cases, renewable energy is more expensive per kilowatt hour than the old stuff. And this means that society moves labor and capital from highly productive sectors to slightly less productive sectors. So you move the German auto workers from producing old-fashioned fossil-based Mercedes to more expensive electric vehicles. And the effect is that from the user point of view, he gets a cleaner world and more costly products. So real consumption goes down, which is, you know, and that's, so the real, so this is the TFP for those people who understand what is total factor productivity, actually goes down a little bit. So physical output goes down. The same workers can only produce slightly fewer of the more expensive electric cars because they are more expensive. It requires more capacity to produce them. The interesting thing, which means, is that the effect on GDP is much smaller, because what happens when you move to the electric car is that the average price of cars go up, but the number of cars being produced go down. If you multiply the two, the effect on GDP is zero, which is, and this is, I mention this for those of you who have an inkling of what I'm talking about. This is one of the really interesting things that no one seems to be aware of. If you run a modern society into environmental constraints in a manner which leads to higher resource costs, either because the resource gets scarcer and more expensive, or because you start substituting green solutions that are also more expensive, the effect on the GDP is close to zero. Because you get slightly less of something which is more valuable, and the product of the two stays the same. And this is the underlying reality why I am so willing to debate all those people that have views on GDP. You know, all of them are wrong, because running into constraints does not lead to lower GDP. It leads to lower growth in the economy. The growth rate goes down, and it leads to lower real consumption, but it does not lead to lower GDP, which has the ironic side effect that if we just sat quietly in the movement, and I stopped being an activist, and the world runs into these constraints, those people that are solely focused on GDP will say there is no problem, because they look at the GDP and it keeps rising. It keeps rising because gas gets more expensive. You know, so you have seen this just now. And so from the point of view of the investor, from the point of view of those that are focused on GDP, nothing is wrong. But from the point of view of Ulrich and all the other very poor Germans, that his heart bleeds for those, you know, and for you. You know, this is really bad, because the real consumption, the amount of gas that you can actually produce, buy for your salary, goes down. So here there is a lot of muddled thinking in the world. This is complicated. This is the type of thing that green economics courses ought to talk about, you know, instead of decoupling or not decoupling. The fact that using the conventional indicator of GDP, you will not see, you know, the effects of society running into constraints. You will only see it from the individual point of view, where belt tightening becomes more and more necessary, because the physical products that you're using gets more and more expensive because of the boundaries. Sorry for using all this time. I should not have done, but you are at least an educated audience. So it might mean that at least some of you remember that I said this, you know, although you don't think it is true. Remember, Jørgen said that if you only focus on GDP, you will not see the problem when you're entering into constraints. It is not the way that most people draw these diagrams. The higher the damage, the lower the GDP. That's not the case. Okay, and then let me just complete, and then you ask. And so that's the reason why this arrow. So the total the physical output goes down, but the price goes up, so there is no effect on GDP. There is effect here. Going back, so now we have the accumulated environmental damage also enters into the average well-being, and then we have only the inequality. How do we explain inequality in the model? It is not very well done, but it starts from the worker share of income, you know, which is the central dividing principle in modern economies. You know, it's how much of the total national income accrues to the owners and how much goes to the workers. And that concept, luckily, has been measured endlessly in the United States and elsewhere. So here we have very good data on how this fight between capital and labor and capital actually ends up in quantitative terms in Western society. And you see what you would have expected, that in the United States, the worker share of output is much lower than it is in decent countries like Norway. I actually don't know what is the situation here. So Norway, the workers take, you know, of the order of 62%, perhaps up to 68%. In the United States, you know, they get down in the middle 50s. You know, what confuses these numbers is that people must remember whether this is before or after tax. And so you should use the numbers before tax, you know, in order to see the share. This is, of course, dead center to your concern about the Phillips curve, because the Phillips curve is, of course, one of the things that determines the worker's share of income. That's the important role of the Phillips curve in our system's point of view. It is not the stability of the relationship, etc., but it is the fact that what determines wage rise is unemployment. So if there is a lot of unemployment, people don't have the bargaining power. And wage rise starts to taper off, and after a while, the worker share of income also starts to go down. Finally, so this is inequality, but certainly inequality is affected by taxes in the sense that the higher taxes, the more money the government can transfer from rich to poor if they want to. And so that's why taxes are important here. They also determine savings, because if the government takes the money, then the private sector cannot save. And taxes, of course, have a positive effect on governmental spending. The more you have of this, the more goods you do get this way. Finally comes the question of what determines the taxes and what determines the regulation bans and the other ugly things that strong governments, active governments are doing. Well, it is, of course, the support for public policy action, which is the basic idea, which in the high-level description is determined by the trust in government, which is in the model system as it currently sits, influenced by two things. First of all, the social tension that we have been speaking about. When there is lasting social tensions, the trust in government goes down, and the willingness to support good action goes down, which means that the fraction in green solution goes down, which means that this thing stays high, which means that the well-being declines. And I guess that is essentially it. And here is, of course, the same loop that you have seen before, that the social tension is determined by the perceived rate of progress. What is the rate of progress? It is the well-being today minus the well-being 5 years ago, so that you see whether you're, like the Chinese, feel that you're moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction. And then the social tension also then works with inequality, public services, disposable income, and accumulated environmental damage. These are the 5 influences on average well-being. And that is, I think, essentially it. So this is, if you wanted to tell your spouse or wife or mother or whoever, what did he talk about? This is probably the simplest way of trying to tell what he spoke about. And it is, of course, much, much simpler than what we're going to talk about later. But this, I think, and the important thing here is to remember to distinguish between, so society is not one type of people, it's 2 types of people, it's workers and owners. And the economy is not one sector, it is a private sector and the public sector. Both of them produce things that are of importance for people. It is not the fact that government is waste and taxes should be 0. Governments are important because they produce collective goods and services for people. And finally, running into planetary boundaries leads to higher costs per unit, which actually does not impact on the GDP, but it actually lowers the growth rate because the increase in resource cost leads to higher costs of capital. So that Then I've forgotten the one final thing that was added at 6 o'clock this morning, which is the link from accumulated environmental damage via the life of capital into capacity addition. I think that one of the things that we will observe as times go by is that the life of infrastructure, the life of buildings, the life of machinery, the life of roads, the life of things is starting to go down as we get more and more hurricanes and more extreme weather, etc. In the model system, the average life of infrastructure is 15 years. And it does not take much when you do back of the envelope calculations to say that this could easily go down by 10% to 13.5 years as the average lifetime of a road or whatever. And if you do this, you see that this really reduces the growth rate in the economy, because you do have to then supply new replacements for this thing. So yes, the amount of national income that is being used for reinvestment in new infrastructure stays more or less the same, but the decay is faster, which means that the stock actually grows more slowly. Yet another very interesting example of the stock and flow consistency, which is very important, when you're running, doing analysis like this in the long term. So the concept of real capital formation exists, in the national accounts and in normal neoclassical theory, but capital discard, what Ulrich spoke about yesterday with the big tankers, that actually, you lose the money, you lose ownership, you lose everything. The ship is still there. The ship is still depressing, the market until you pay the money to get it hauled to India and onto those beaches in Bangladesh that you have seen where they cut these big pieces, new tankers into steel. That's finally the end of life, and that's when you can start building a new one. Again, important to distinguish between physical reality and this. Good. That's going to be a horrible breakfast when you're going to talk to your spouse about what Jørgen said. Questions on this level? Yes, please. Wait until, because then I can also hear what you say. Could you move a little closer, because you ask complicated questions and you are difficult to hear.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you just scale the scale factors. Everything is a scale factor there, yeah? And if the GDP stays the same, then you just move the scale factor to another point. Is that right?
What is a scale factor?
A scaling factor, just scale.
Okay, ask the question. Yeah, I don't understand.
So if the GDP, I don't know, changes.
Yeah, increase.
Yeah, increase or decrease, I don't know. So then, and it stays the same because of, I don't know, the output. Then you just move the scale factor to another point. For example, on an environmental impact.
Okay, so what a causal diagram does, it is an indication of an underlying causal relationship. So what we're basically saying here, that when national income increases, then disposable income per person increases. If disposable income per person increases, then all else equal, the average well-being will also be going up. If the accumulated environmental damage goes up, if more forests are cut, if there is a higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, then all else equal, average well-being goes down. These small minus signs indicates the polarity of the causal relationships. So this is a causal loop diagram, and it is physically based, and it says that if something goes up, then as a consequence of physical law, something else goes down.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I want to know. It's a balance, you have balance. On one way it goes up, and on the other point it goes down.
Yes.
Now I understand it. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, but you also ask often complicated questions. Not complicated for me, but perhaps So keep it short.
Sorry.
So sorry for being so rude, but since I've spoken to some of you a lot earlier, I know what is coming. No. So with an introduction like this.
I just wanted to ask all public if the capacity addition by the public services is only tax financed by the government.
In the fine detail, the governments borrow, private sector borrows, so all of this is leveraged investments.
How should I formulate it? In your model, there stands tax financed government public well-being.
Yes.
So the money for these services are coming from the taxes of the people.
Yes.
More or less.
Yes.
But a government with its own currency and a monopoly in its own currency has practically the option to finance it without taxes. That's just, is this fact in this module, or is it not in to keep it simple?
No. So exactly. Of course, debt financing of activity is in the detailed model. Both for households, for governments, and for the owners. The debt can either be borrowed money from abroad or from the rich, and it can be printed money according to modern monetary theory. That means new debt created by private banks. So it is all consistent with modern monetary theory, and that is what you were basically interested in.
Thank you.
I'm pleased to say that it is so. So if we ever get there, I'm of course going to show you the part of the model where interest rates are being determined, which is a description of central bank operations, again at a high level of aggregation, and again, not according to the ISLM, theory of the neoclassicists, but according to modern monetary theory. And at this point in time, to brag, I normally say that I have been the chairman of 3 banks, during my life. A commercial bank, an industrial policy bank, and a bank we made 10 years ago in order to make money. So we entered into this fantastically lucrative business of lending money to people like yourself, who didn't get money from other banks, just in order to see that you can get very rich from doing so, and we did. So we made a point. But poor those guys that borrowed the money.
Yeah, just one question from my side. The influence on inequality. Yeah. It's in this simplified model, it's only reduced by taxes.
Yes.
What are other influences and possibilities to reduce inequality in a society?
So the main influence is not there because it is the worker share of income. So anything you can do to unionize so that you increase the force, the negotiation power of workers so that they manage to increase the wage level, which in turn is the same as increasing the worker share of income, helps.
And also education should help, huh?
But that's one. Yes, it does. But now you get back to the art of modeling, because is it education in itself that leads to higher or a lower inequality, or is it the consequences of the union being much more educated, meaning that they can run a strategy, etc. And we believe the latter. So we're all the way trying to push things down as close to the earth as possible. Very, very interesting question from a conceptualization and modeling point of view.
Yeah, my question connects to that one. I wondered how you choose the level of complexity. Is it purely based?
Good. Now you're starting to ask. So, and so system dynamics, which is the methodology that I'm pushing and Ulrich is pushing, when this was first developed around 1970, we really thought that this was going to sell like wildfire, because here you finally have a tool which can handle all the soft discussions that we have, unmeasured things for which there is no data. You can actually convert it into a model. So we thought that this was going to spread very quickly from the 100 people that were interested in 1970. We thought that there would be 10,000 at the end, at around 2000, and then we assumed that there would be 100,000 practicing system analysis at this point in time. We're still only 1,000. So there we really failed. The question is why? And this is because of your question. People seem to be very unable to produce useful theory. They are producing, they look at segments, they get hung up in one thing, namely the influence of the forest tax on the cutting of forests in regulated forests around here, or some one link like this, and they sacrifice their lifetime on looking at the detail of this. While what you need to do in order to make models that are useful for global policy is, of course, what you said. You have to disregard all those things that in reality are not important. And how are you going to know this? And the only way to know this is, that's why I'm bragging about being the chairman of 3 banks. The only way you can do it is to live with the bastards. And this is anthropology. Basically you need to know firsthand. You need to invest in a ship. That's only when you start understanding what losing money in a market is all about. Reading the book of other academics that have been thinking about these problems is not very helpful if you want to make a good model. And so this is difficult. And it is trial and error. It's very much more an art. And then I'll say a final thing, which, since we are close to Karl Marx here, creating good socioeconomic theory is so complicated that you know the names of those few individuals that have actually done something. Karl, he pointed to the worker share of income, the dynamics around the split between the two. Veblen, he looked at conspicuous consumption, the idea that the rich people do not reinvest the money into productive capacity, as the neoclassics people say. They do conspicuous consumption. They buy ever bigger estates and ever bigger, etc., etc. Keynes was the person who said that, the system is not supply-driven, in their language. It's demand. So you just create the demand and then you get the supply. Which is, of course, true, totally true in our view, because we have the circular view, where supply generates income, generates demand, generates supply. So since we have the circular understanding of the world, so that's Veblen. Who else has invented fantastic things? Yes, Minsky instability. If you have, that does, no one nods their head. So who are other great? So in the old days, creating a good model in socioeconomic reality was viewed and was so difficult that it typically took a lifetime for a person to gain the understanding that was enough to then generalize and create a useful simplification. System dynamics tool makes it look much, much simpler, because you can just, it takes a second, in the model to introduce a totally new variable, assume that it's linked from this to this and that to this, and you can test whether it works or not. And then, if it works and if you like it, you just include it. But then it may well be that this just clutters. You know, it does not increase transparency and understanding. So again, sorry for the long answer, but you, for one, be of pedagogic value in the sense that perhaps you lower your respect for theory, or the formation of bad theory, and increase your respect for those few people who have seen something that others have not seen. Yes.
One more question. It's a detail, but I think an important detail. The neoclassical economics, tax economics, they are focusing very much on excess burden of taxation. And some say, for instance, what you need in order to achieve your goals, you need, for instance, income tax. But they are saying, okay, the marginal rate of excess burden, it might be about 40%. You know? And others, like the value-added tax, which is not so friendly in terms of redistribution, maybe much less. So how are you dealing with such question?
So the main way of dealing this is that in the detailed model, and I showed you the 2 pages of garbage, which is, you know, tries to track the effects of taxes, is that in the end, it matters whether you tax this. So there are 2 groups, the owners and the workers. And it matters a lot whether you tax the workers or tax the owners. Because very coarsely, if you tax the owners, that reduces investment and reduces the growth rate in the economy. If you tax consumers, it reduces demand. And it actually then, for a while, makes investment unprofitable and then lowers the investment. So at that level, it's relatively simple. If you then go one step further down and you ask, should I tax the savings of the worker? And should I tax the consumption of the workers? That's the value-added tax is, of course, the consumption of the workers. Then you get some effects if you do the same thing on the other side, etc., etc. So yes, we're doing this. We're doing it at a detail which I think is sufficient. You know, I think that when you get down to those finer details, in reality, they don't matter a lot in the long term. They matter a lot if you are in the equilibrium thinking. But it is the effect of the growth rate which is the important thing in a long-term system dynamics. It's not the absolute level. Again, good question, and one, like each little link, you know, in this model, the hundreds of them, are open for exactly this type of discussion. And one of the interesting things about system dynamics is, of course, that in a causal diagram, you can go in the real model, people understand, it is possible to explain to people what's going on and discuss it. We will do that now, because now this is starting to get tiring. So when is lunch? When is the next break? 12 o'clock. Perfect. Then I'll just fill with something which is much lower level of intellectualism. What we have been talking about now are very important, very complicated. We as old model builders belonging to one school have answers to these questions, but that is after 50 years of practice. If you then ask, can you give me a textbook which actually tells about these things? The horrible fact is that the book written by our guru, Mr. Forrester, in 1956, called Industrial Dynamics, has 50 pages of appendixes at the end. And each of those handles one of the questions that you have now asked. And he wrote those in 1956, and no one has been able to write, you know, things which in 2 or 3 pages answers these fundamental questions of what is the proper level of aggregation, what is the scope of the model, You know, what should be the time horizon? What things should you drop? What should you include, etc. A man called John Sterman, who is 50 years younger than Forrester, and is now the eminent professor of system dynamics at MIT. He has written a very thick book, which is very much more modern, called Business Dynamics, which is very good, you know. But again, he stands on the shoulders of his boss, you know, Jay, and Jay is totally inaccessible. You can read it, and if you don't understand system dynamics, you won't understand a word of what is there. If you understand a little bit, you see that that man could already 60 years ago, 70 years ago, tell you all the answers to very complicated modeling questions like those. He was very bright. He was the inventor of the random access memory card in the first computers. That's where, and then he built actually the first digital computer in the late 1940s. He was a control engineer. Good. Simple question because.
I just wanted to know whether the political state has any influence on the well-being of a country, of a person, of a state.
Yes. In our representation, it is largely the public services per person. So the amount of, you know, first of all, the production of goods and services, the supply of roads, the supply of dams, the supply of infrastructure. Secondly, the schools, the military, you know, all. So essentially the whole governmental budget in most places of the world, the non-corrupt parts of the world, goes to providing things that is good for one group or another in society, in our view. So that leads to the other question. So what about corruption? Just so we have done this. Yeah, so where is corruption in the model system? And it is not handled explicitly anywhere because we do not have a theory for when does thing become corrupt. Our view is that everything is corrupt. So every now and then you run into the positive situation where for 50 years, like in the North European countries over the last 50 years, we have been surprisingly free of corruption. Corruption basically slows economic development. That's essentially what it does. Or it redirects it. So when Putin and the guys, you know, they take a certain part of the national income and then they put it into things that does not really further the common good. But, you know, so they build these wonderful castles along the Black Sea coast and buy big jets and they build the super yachts that you see. What does this do to the economy? It simply doesn't anything except that it moves some shipyard workers from Algeria across the lake, and so they build super yachts in South France instead. You know, at the big picture, corruption is at that level. The structural effect of corruption on the economy is not that big, but it is big on the growth rate. You know, it's on what it takes in order to get the economy to function. You know, how much you have to wait before you get the permission to do something and how many people you have to bribe, you know, in order to get it to happen.
Inequality should go down.
That is, yeah, that's an interesting one. Yes. Yes.